Welcome to DriverDTrains. Thanks for stopping by. I'm your host, DriverD. Our conductor and brakeman, Scratchy-C, is keeping a watchful eye on our train. In my last video, number 7B, Automating a Train with DCC-EX EX Rail, we went step by step together through the process of creating the set of rollout automations that I use to drive the train to the end of the layout and back again each time I complete an operating session on the D-Saver. We organized our work by using EX Rail sequences and aliases and used timers to create 4 slightly different versions of the automation to use depending on how many freight cars are in our train. Hopefully you had a chance to try out those automations yourself on your own layout. In this video, part 3 in the series, we'll create a version of the automation that uses a sensor to detect when our train has reached the end of the layout. Thanks to our use of sequences and aliases in the last video, this will be a piece of cake, and we will easily be able to modify the automation to use a sensor. Be sure to check this video's description for links to the other videos in the series, as well as the various websites and products I mention here. Also, if you are enjoying the videos, please leave a comment and hit the like button. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. It may be cold outside, but trains keep moving, rain or shine. So grab your things and let's get started. Adding a sensor to our automation in DCC-EX EX Rail. In my last video, we created an automation to drive a train from one end of the layout to the other and back again. We used timers to tell the locomotive how long to drive and how long to back up, and created 4 slightly different versions of the automation to choose from, depending on whether the locomotive was pulling 1, 2, 3, or 4 freight cars in the train. In this video, we'll create a version of the automation that uses a sensor to detect when the locomotive has reached the end of the layout. The most logical and straightforward way to do this is to add a sensor at each end of the layout where we want the train to stop. Infrared photosensors are commonly used for this. However, because I don't have a good place to mount a photosensor, I decided to use an electrical block occupancy sensor instead. Then, just to make things more interesting, instead of 2 sensors, I used just 1 sensor to detect the train at both ends of the layout. This adds some complexity to our automation, but will give us the opportunity to learn some new tricks we can use in EX Rail. We'll also create a virtual sensor while we're at it, so that we can run the automation even if we don't have a sensor on the layout, which means that you can try out the automation yourself on your layout. Be sure to look for a community post with all the EX Rail script from today's video, so you can try out the automation yourself. Here are all the duty assignments listed on the train board. First, we'll look at how to connect the sensor to our layout and to our DCC-EX command station. Then we'll modify our EX Rail script and add the sensor to our rollout automations. Finally, we'll run some trains. We've got our orders, so let's move out. Adding a sensor to our automation in DCC-EX EX Rail. Step 1. Add a sensor to our layout. Now that we've seen how to create the rollout automation to drive our train using timers, let's take a look at how we can add a sensor to our layout and use it to control the automation. This will allow us to run just one automation regardless of the number of cars in the train. There are various types of sensors that we can use on our layouts that are compatible with DCC-EX, including photosensors, RFID radio tags, and time-of-flight lasers. But for this example, we will use an NCE BD20 block occupancy sensor, which detects current flowing through an electrically isolated block of track. I'll include a link to the sensor in this video's description. In this case, we will actually use the same sensor for both the starting block and the ending block of track. Because we know that our train will never occupy both blocks at once, we can get away with using only one sensor, although it adds a bit of complexity to our automation. Another complication that comes from using the block occupancy sensor instead of a photosensor is that we need a freight car that conducts electricity at the back of the train to activate the sensor. The locomotive will always activate the block sensor at the ending block of track, but we also need to make sure that the freight car at the back of our train activates the sensor at the starting block. We can do this if the freight car has a resistor wheel set on it, or if it is lighted, such as with a lighted caboose, or if it has an electronic circuit that makes sounds, for example. In my case, I use this yellow rail box with a flashing rear end device to activate the sensor. Again, if we used two photosensors instead of just one block occupancy sensor, we wouldn't have to worry about this. Alternatively, we could just let the train back up until the locomotive enters the starting block. However, on the D-Saver, that would send the freight cars sailing off the end of the layout, so we'll find another solution. Connecting the block occupancy sensor to our DCC-EX command station is very simple, as it connects to the Arduino with just 3 wires. One wire runs from the plus 5 to 12 volt connector on the sensor to one of the 5 volt pins on the Arduino, and a second wire runs from the GND connector to one of the ground pins. The third wire for the sensor output runs from the logic connector on the sensor to one of the digital input-output pins on the Arduino. We don't use the relay connector on the sensor for the automation. For this example, I have connected the 5 volt wire and ground wires to 5 volt and ground pins in the header socket at the back of the Arduino Mega, which is the side opposite the USB connector, and the logic wire to pin 30, which is also in the socket at the back. We'll need to know that last one for our automation script. We'll also need to make sure that the starting and ending blocks of track are electrically isolated from the rest of the track on our layout. I used plastic rail joiners to do this, but we could also just gap the rail. We only need to do this for one rail, although I isolated both rails since I also used the starting block as the DCC programming track. Finally, we'll need to run the track feeder wire for the isolated blocks of track through the middle of the detection ring on the sensor and loop it around the ring a turn before connecting it up to the track. Alternatively, if our feeder wires are small enough, we may be able to loop 2 of them through the sensor ring rather than connecting the 2 blocks of track together. In either case, we need to make sure that the track feeder wire for each block is connected to the appropriate track main power lead because we don't want any short circuits. That completes adding the sensor to our layout and connecting it up to our DCC-EX command station. Now let's add the sensor to the rollout automation. Step 2. Add the sensor to the rollout automation. Now that we've connected the sensor to our layout and DCC-EX command station, let's look at how we can use it in the rollout automation. Our new automation will use the same sequences as the other rollout automations we created in the previous video, so we'll start by copying one of our other automations and assign it the number 10. We'll call it rollout without specifying any number of cars. Then we just need to replace the delay timers in the automation with sensor checks. To check for a sensor, we use the EXRail @ command along with the Arduino pin number or an alias of the pin number that the sensor is connected to. For example, if we had simply used a photosensor or something similar at each end of the layout and connected them to pins 30 and 31 on the Arduino, we could create two aliases called start sensor and end sensor, and then replace the first delay in our automation with an @end sensor command, and the second delay with an @start sensor command, and we'd be done. The train would drive down the track until it triggers the sensor at the end of the layout, then stop and back up until it triggers the sensor back at the starting point where it would shut down. It's that simple. We're going to make things much more challenging. Let's jot down some notes and then we'll come back and fill in the script. First, because we are using a block occupancy sensor and don't want the train to back off the layout, we should check at the start to make sure that there is a freight car at the starting block that the sensor can detect. That way we'll know that the sensor will detect the train as it's backing up, and the automation will know to tell the train to stop and shut down before it backs off the layout. But what should we do if the sensor does not detect a freight car? We could simply cancel the automation. But instead, how about we ask the engineer if they want to proceed anyway? We'll look at how we can do this with a virtual sensor. Once we know that it is okay to start, we call our drive loco sequence just as we did in the last video. Then, once the train is rolling, we need to wait for it to clear the starting block before we check to see if it has reached the ending block. That is because we are using the same sensor for both blocks of track. Once the train clears the starting block, we'll wait until it triggers the sensor again when it reaches the ending block. We then call the stop loco and back loco sequences. Then we wait for the locomotive to clear the ending block and back up to the starting block. When the freight car at the back of the train reaches the starting block, we call the shutdown sequence. That will complete our automation. Now, let's go back and enter the script to do those things. First, let's create an alias for our block sensor. That way, if we ever connect the sensor to a different pin, we only need to update the alias. Next, we want to check if the sensor can detect a freight car at the starting block, and if not, we want to ask the engineer what to do. We can use the EXRail if not command to check if the sensor is not being activated by a freight car. If the sensor is active, our automation will skip the next steps and proceed to the drive loco sequence. But if the sensor is not active, we'll display a message on the LCD that no train is detected, and then sound 2 short blasts on the horn to get the engineer's attention. Then we'll wait for up to 10 seconds for the engineer to manually trigger the sensor. We can do this with the EXRail @timeout command. The @timeout command waits for up to a specified amount of time for a sensor to activate before moving on. We'll wait up to 10 seconds for the engineer to activate our block sensor before continuing. We'll talk about how the engineer can activate the sensor in a moment. But first, we add the if timeout command after the @timeout command. This lets us decide what to do if the engineer never activated the sensor during the time we waited. In this case, we'll restore the LCD to its original message, unjoin the main and programming tracks, and end the automation without going any further. However, if our sensor did see the freight car at the starting block, or if the engineer manually activated the sensor, we will continue with the drive loco sequence from our previous automations. This will start the train moving down the track as the locomotive sounds its horn. We are also going to add a 6-second delay, which is about how long it takes the locomotive to start moving in the drive loco sequence before we check the sensor again, to minimize the chance that we get a glitch in our sensor reading. I have found that sometimes when the freight car starts rolling, the sensor reading cuts out for a split second, which makes the automation think that the train has reached the end of the layout, when it is actually still at the starting block. By waiting for the train to start rolling, we reduce the chance of a false reading. Now we need to make sure the train clears the starting block before we check to see if it has reached the end of the layout. Again, we wouldn't have to do this if we used 2 sensors, but where's the learning in that? There are 2 possible scenarios we need to consider. The first scenario is that the sensor saw the freight car at the starting block. The second is that it didn't, and the engineer triggered the sensor manually. Again, we can use the @timeout command, with a very short delay this time, say 200 milliseconds, to check if the sensor can see the freight car on the starting block. If the command times out without seeing the freight car, we can assume that the train is on its way and we can start watching for the locomotive to enter the ending block of track. However, if the sensor sees the freight car still on the starting block, then we need to wait for it to clear the block. We can do this with the EX rail after sensor command. This instructs our automation to wait until after the sensor clears when the freight car leaves the starting block before going on. Now we just wait for the sensor to see the locomotive when it enters the ending block. Again, we do this with the @sensor command. We'll add a short 1.5 second delay to let the locomotive get fully into the block, then call the stop loco sequence from our prior automations. This will stop the train at the ending block. Then we'll call the back loco sequence to start the train moving back towards its starting point. We'll wait 1 second to make sure the train is rolling again, backwards this time, and then use the after sensor command to wait for the locomotive to leave the ending block. Then we use another @sensor command to wait for the freight car to return to the starting block. We'll add another delay, 15 seconds this time, to let the freight car get all the way into the starting block, and then call the shutdown sequence. That's it! Our train can now run from one end of the layout to the other and back again using a sensor. Now, let's talk about how we can let the engineer manually trigger the sensor if the freight car doesn't do it. First, there is the physical option. If the freight car is on the track but not triggering the sensor, the engineer may be able to move the car a bit to get the sensor to see it. However, we can also create a way for the engineer to trigger the sensor manually in the automation by using the EXRail latch command. In fact, this method will work even if we don't actually have a sensor, which means that we can create a virtual sensor. To allow the engineer to activate this virtual sensor, we will create a route that will show up in the throttle that the engineer can select to trigger the sensor. We'll create an alias for our route and then the route itself. We'll display a message in the throttle that the rollout automation is OK to go. Note that this route will run independently from the rollout automation and is not called from within the rollout automation. Rather, we activate the route in our throttle and can do so anytime we want, even if the rollout automation is not running. Therefore, we will end the route with a done command rather than a return command. Next, we'll display a message on the LCD display that the rollout automation is OK to go. Then we'll use the EXRail latch command to manually trigger our sensor. Note that this is a virtual sensor and does not actually do anything to the physical sensor. It just makes EXRail think that the sensor is activated. Then we'll wait 1 second and unlatch the sensor, after which our route automation will finish. However, by briefly latching or activating the sensor with our route, the rollout automation will get the message that it is OK for the train to proceed down the track, even if it doesn't see a freight car at the starting block. Note that we will need to activate the route in our throttle again when we are ready for the train to stop backing up at the end of the automation, since there is still no freight car to trigger the sensor. We could even take this a step further and run the automation without any sensor at all, by using the OK to go route to start and stop the train at each end of the layout. While letting the automation do all the other things in between. We'll explore these types of hybrid automations further in the next video.
Hold it for a stop for me. Got the maintenance way up pity there. Should be clear in any minute though.
But that job can wait until next time. So put away your notepad and let's go find our train. All aboard! Step 3. Let's run some trains. We have now seen how to create a simple automation to drive a train with a locomotive and from 1 to 4 freight cars from one end of the track to the other and then back again using a modular and flexible approach with both timers and sensors. We can use the lessons we learned today to create even more complex and varied automations in the future. We'll look at an example in the next video. But we finished our duty assignment for today, and with that we're done. So let's go run some trains. What's next? Automating 2 locomotives with DCC-EX, EX rail. In my next video, we'll look at a more complex example of an automation that uses 2 locomotives working together to switch 3 freight cars from one track to another. To do this, we'll learn some new ways to control the flow of our automations so that they take turns working in tandem. And again, we'll do this without needing to add any additional hardware to our layout. After that, we'll look at how to add a second LCD to our DCC-EX command station and use that LCD to display information about our locomotives. Be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss those upcoming videos, and check this video's description for links to my other videos, including my video series on assembling a DCC-EX command station and my series on using JMRI's Decoder Pro app to control our trains. But it's best to keep moving on a cold day like this, so we'll save the chit-chat for another time. Until then, thanks for watching. Well, Scratchy, what were you looking for? What? Santa has a secret boxcar full of gifts? Scratchy! All aboard!